The war between humanity and the Salvarian Empire had been brutal. Millions had died on both sides. Planets had burned. For years, Captain Dax Raylan had fought on the front lines, pushing back against the technologically superior Salvarians. His name had become legend, whispered in both fear and respect across the galaxy. And now, after a final decisive battle, the Salvarian Empire had surrendered. Dax stood in the Grand Hall of the Salvarian High Court, surrounded by towering alien warriors with sharp features and glowing violet eyes. The Salvarian king, a proud and ruthless ruler, had been forced to kneel before humanity's representatives. It should have been a moment of triumph, but what happened next sent shockwaves through the room. As a sign of our submission, the king said, his voice bitter, "I offer my daughter, Princess Kayla Xalvaris, to Captain Dax Raylan as a gift for his mercy." A murmur spread through the chamber. Even the humans looked surprised. This was no ordinary surrender. This was humiliation. Kayla had been a symbol of Salvarian pride, a warrior princess who had led rebellions against her father's rule, against humanity. And now she was being handed over like a prize. The doors swung open, and Kayla was brought in, her hands bound in shimmering energy cuffs. Her violet eyes burned with fury as she was forced to her knees before Dax. She was nothing like the other Salvarian royals. Her battle-worn armor was dented, her dark blue hair wild, and her gaze held no fear, only defiance. "Take her," the king ordered, "and do with her as you see fit." Dax clenched his jaw. He had fought aliens, killed them, outsmarted them. But this was something else. He hadn't come here to claim a trophy. But as he looked at Kayla, he saw something in her eyes. Hate, yes, but also fire, a warrior's spirit. Kayla spat at his feet. "I will never serve a human." Dax sighed. "Yeah, I figured." He didn't know it then, but those words would come back to haunt them both. Their transport ship left Salvarian space under heavy guard. Kayla sat across from Dax, her arms still bound, glaring at him like a caged animal. "You think you've won," she hissed. "You haven't." Dax leaned back. "I didn't ask for you, but I'm not in the habit of letting prisoners escape, so get comfortable." She bared her teeth in something between a smirk and a snarl. "You'll regret this, human." The tension between them was thick, but they didn't have time to dwell on it, because just as they entered hyperspace, alarms blared. The ship shook violently, metal groaning under impact. An explosion rocked the hull. "Incoming fire," a pilot shouted. Dax grabbed the nearest console. "Who's attacking us?" "Salvarian insurgents." Of course, not all Salvarians agreed with surrendering, and some would rather see Kayla dead than let her fall into human hands. The ship buckled as another blast struck. Kayla yanked against her bindings. "Let me fight." Dax hesitated. He didn't trust her. But then the ship lurched again, and he made a choice. He slammed the release on her cuffs. "Don't make me regret this," he growled. Kayla grinned, right before grabbing a fallen soldier's weapon and diving into battle. The fight was chaos. The insurgents had already boarded. Gunfire echoed through the corridors as humans and Salvarians clashed. Kayla moved like a storm, cutting through her own kind with ruthless efficiency. Dax fought beside her, covering her blind spots. For a brief moment, there was an understanding between them. Survival first. But then another explosion tore through the ship. The hull breached, oxygen vented, and the world turned to fire and screaming. Dax barely had time to grab Kayla before the blast threw them both into the void. He didn't remember crashing. Only pain. Only darkness. When he came to, the sky above him was burning. They had crashed on an uncharted planet. The wreckage of their ship smoldered around them, bodies scattered in the dirt. Kayla was alive, coughing as she pushed debris off herself. Dax groaned, trying to sit up. "You okay?" Kayla shot him a glare. "I should have let you die." "Good to know we're still on friendly terms." The air was thick with the scent of burning metal. The jungle around them was dense, alive with eerie sounds. And somewhere in the distance, a low growl echoed. They weren't alone. Kayla stood, scanning their surroundings. We need weapons, shelter, and we need to move, now. Dax got to his feet, wincing. You're giving me orders now. She smirked. Do you have a better plan? He didn't. They moved quickly, scavenging what they could from the wreck. Kayla found a pulse rifle. Dax armed himself with a combat knife and a damaged pistol. The jungle around them was alive with movement, shadows shifting between the trees. And then the first creature attacked. It was fast, too fast. A blur of scales and claws. Dax barely had time to dodge as it lunged. Kayla fired, hitting it midair. The beast screeched and collapsed. Great, Dax muttered. Now we've pissed it off. Because more were coming. The next few hours were a blur of running, fighting, and trying not to die. The jungle was merciless, filled with predators that saw them as prey. But Kayla fought like a demon, her Salvarian instincts keeping them alive. By the time they found shelter, they were exhausted, covered in blood. Some of it theirs, most of it not. Dax collapsed against a rock. So, how's your day going? Kayla wiped sweat from her brow. Better than being your prisoner. He laughed, surprising himself. They sat in silence for a moment, catching their breath. Then Kayla spoke, her voice quieter. Why didn't you just let me die? Dax glanced at her. Because I don't kill for no reason. And because, like it or not, we're stuck together. She looked at him for a long moment. Then, for the first time, she nodded. It wasn't peace, but it was something. The night passed without incident, but the real danger was still ahead. They needed to find a way off the planet, and fast. Because what they didn't know was that the insurgents hadn't given up. They were coming. And they weren't taking prisoners. The dense jungle stretched endlessly around them, alive with strange sounds and unseen predators. The air was thick and humid, every breath heavy. Dax Rillen wiped sweat from his brow, his muscles aching from the endless battles they'd already fought. Beside him, Kayla Salvaris moved with the grace of a seasoned warrior, her eyes scanning the foliage for threats. Despite the tension between them, there was no denying her skill. She had already saved his life more than once, even if she still seemed furious about it. You're slowing me down, human, she snapped, brushing a strand of her dark blue hair out of her face. Maybe if you'd stop charging into every fight, we wouldn't have so many things trying to kill us. Dax shot back. Their words were sharp, but there was an understanding forming beneath the hostility. They needed each other. The jungle was too dangerous for either of them to survive alone. Every few minutes, an eerie growl or rustling in the underbrush reminded them of that fact. As they moved through the alien landscape, Dax kept his eyes on their surroundings, but his mind was turning over what had happened. The ambush, the crash, it all felt too coordinated. The insurgents had known exactly when and where to strike. And now they were stuck on an uncharted planet with no way off and no backup. Kayla stopped suddenly, her hand raised. Dax froze. He heard it too, a faint whirring sound, mechanical and unnatural. Drones, she whispered. The word sent a chill down his spine. They shouldn't have been here. Salvarian hunter drones were elite machines, built for tracking and killing with terrifying efficiency. If they were here, it meant someone had sent them. And it wasn't just random insurgents. Move, Kayla hissed. They ran. The jungle blurred around them as they sprinted, weaving through trees and leaping over roots. The whirring grew louder, joined by the unmistakable sound of weapons charging. A burst of plasma shot past them, searing the bark of a tree. Dax dove behind a fallen log, dragging Kayla with him, just as the drones descended. Sleek and black, they moved like shadows, their glowing red sensors sweeping the area. How many? He asked, his voice low. 4, maybe more, Kayla replied, her breathing steady despite the danger. Dax checked his pistol. Only a few shots left. We're not going to outrun them. Kayla's eyes narrowed. Then we don't run. Before he could stop her, she was up and moving. She fired a precise shot, hitting the nearest drone, and sending it spiraling into the ground in a shower of sparks. The others reacted instantly, weapons blazing. Dax joined her, his shots less accurate, but just as deadly. One drone exploded. Another clipped Dax's arm, sending a searing pain through his shoulder. He bit back a curse, taking cover as Kayla advanced with terrifying efficiency. In minutes, it was over. The drones lay in smoldering pieces around them. Kayla crouched over one of the remains, her expression dark as she examined its markings. "These weren't insurgents," she said. "These are Royal Guard drones." Dax's stomach sank. "Your father's." She nodded slowly. "He's not just trying to punish me. He's trying to erase me." The realization hit hard. This wasn't just a simple hunt. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure Kayla never made it off this planet. And Dax was collateral damage. "We need to reach the distress beacon," he said, pushing to his feet despite the pain in his arm. "Fast." They moved again, the air between them tense. The closer they got to the beacon, the more dangerous the jungle became. The predators grew bolder, the attacks more frequent. And through it all, Dax found himself relying on Kayla more and more. One night, as they sat around a small fire, the weight of their situation settled heavily on them. "Why did your father turn on you?" Dax asked after a long silence. Kayla's jaw tightened. "Because I didn't agree with his war. I fought for my people, not his ambition." Dax watched her carefully. For the first time, there was something vulnerable in her voice. "He saw my defiance as betrayal," she continued. "When we lost, I became his scapegoat." The fire crackled between them. Dax's respect for her grew. She hadn't just been a rebel. She had fought for what she believed was right. "You're not what I expected," he admitted. Kayla's eyes met his, and for a moment, the hostility faded. "Neither are you." The truce didn't last long. The next day, they reached the beacon and walked straight into an ambush. Insurgents poured from the trees, their weapons blazing. Dax and Kayla fought back to back, but they were outnumbered. A blast knocked Dax's pistol from his hand. Kayla screamed as a stun bolt hit her, dropping her to her knees. Dax roared, charging forward. His knife found its mark, and the insurgent fell. But there were too many. A rifle butt struck him from behind, and darkness swallowed him. When he woke, he was bound. The insurgent leader stood over him, a scared Salvarian with cold eyes. "You should have stayed dead, human," he sneered. "But your death will serve our cause." Dax's heart pounded. Across the clearing, Kayla was tied to a post, blood running down her face. Despite everything, her eyes still burned with defiance. The insurgents began preparing their weapons. Execution was imminent. Dax met Kayla's gaze. "We're not dying here." A small, fierce smile touched her lips. "Then you'd better have a plan." He did. It wasn't a good one, but it was all they had. When the first shot rang out, chaos erupted, and Dax Raylan went to war. The distress beacon flickered with weak, sputtering light, but it sent its signal. Dax Raylan and Kayla Xalvaris waited in tense silence, their bodies worn from the endless fights and their minds burdened with the weight of what they had learned. The jungle around them was quiet for once, an uneasy stillness settling over the land. "They'll come," Dax said, his voice rough but certain. Kayla didn't look so sure. "And if they don't?" He glanced at her, the alien princess who had been his enemy, his reluctant ally, and something more he hadn't quite figured out yet. "Then we survive," he said simply. Hours passed before they saw the ship. It descended slowly, its thrusters kicking up clouds of dust and debris. Dax felt the tension leave his body, just a little. He stepped forward, Kayla close behind, as the rescue team emerged, humans in standard military gear. Relief flooded him. "Captain Rylan." The lead soldier called out, lowering his weapon. "We've been looking for you." But the second Dax stepped closer, something felt wrong. The lead soldier's eyes shifted, just a flicker, and Dax saw it, the subtle way his fingers moved toward his sidearm. "Get down," Dax shouted. Too late. The gunfire erupted. The lead soldier fired first, but Dax was already moving, dragging Kayla behind cover. The rescue team, or what they'd thought was a rescue team, turned on them. "Traitors," Kayla hissed, her eyes blazing. Dax's mind raced. This wasn't just insurgents. This was deeper, more dangerous. He returned fire, his shots taking down one of the false rescuers. But they were outnumbered and outgunned. "We have to move," he shouted. They ran. Plasma bolts tore through the air around them, the jungle exploding into chaos. Dax's heart pounded as they sprinted through the underbrush. But the sounds of pursuit followed close behind. An ancient structure arose ahead, an outpost, long abandoned and half buried in vines and moss. They barreled inside, slamming a rusted door shut behind them. The silence was deafening, broken only by their ragged breathing. "We were set up," Kayla said, fury in her voice. Dax nodded grimly. "Someone wants us dead. Badly." As the adrenaline faded, the tension between them finally snapped. "This is your people's fault." Kayla spat, her eyes flashing. "You bring war and destruction everywhere you go." Dax's patience cracked. "My people. You invaded us, remember? Or did you forget the part where your father tried to wipe out an entire planet?" "I defied him," she shot back. "I fought against that war." "Yeah. And now we're both paying the price." The words hung between them, sharp and heavy. The anger simmered, but beneath it was something else, something neither of them was ready to name. After a long silence, Kayla spoke, her voice quieter. "You saved me, more than once." Dax met her gaze. "You saved me too." For a moment, the walls they'd built between them cracked, but the danger outside wouldn't wait. They fortified the outpost, scavenging old weapons and supplies. As they worked, Kayla began to open up, sharing pieces of her past she had never spoken of before. Her rebellion against her father, the price she had paid, the way she had been betrayed by those she trusted. It was then she told him the truth. "The insurgents, they want more than my father's throne. They want war. They want to burn everything." Dax felt a cold weight settle in his gut. "And they'll kill anyone who stands in their way, including you." She nodded. "And you." The fight wasn't over. And the worst was yet to come. The jungle burned around them. The air was thick with the acrid scent of smoke and plasma fire. Dax Raylan pushed forward despite the searing pain in his side. Every step felt heavier than the last, but stopping meant death. Kayla Xalvaris was just ahead, moving with fierce grace, her twin energy blades flashing as she cut through their enemies. "We're not going to make it," Dax shouted over the din of battle. "We have to," Kayla snapped back. Her voice was sharp, but there was fear beneath it. They were both running on fumes, and the enemy kept coming. Dax stumbled, his vision swimming. He felt the heat of a plasma bolt graze his shoulder, and his knees buckled. Before he could hit the ground, Kayla was there. She grabbed his arm, dragging him forward with surprising strength. "Don't you dare give up on me, human," she growled. "Wasn't planning on it," Dax gritted out, though his body was screaming otherwise. Blood trickled down his side, warm and sticky, but they couldn't stop. Not now. The hidden Salvarian ship was their only hope. A small, stealth-class vessel Kayla had told him about, if they could reach it. But the closer they got, the more vicious the attacks became. It was clear their enemies knew what they were aiming for. As they reached a narrow ravine, the ground exploded behind them. Dax barely managed to stay on his feet as Kayla hauled him forward. "We're almost there," she called. But the enemy was closing in. Dax could hear the unmistakable whine of hunter drones above them, and the heavy footfalls of soldiers moving through the jungle. Their chances were slipping away. "Leave me," Dax said through gritted teeth. "You can make it." Kayla whirled on him, her eyes blazing. "I will not leave you behind." There was no room for argument. She kept moving, her grip on his arm firm, and Dax felt something shift in his chest. The cold, proud alien princess he'd met was still there, but now he saw the fierce loyalty and courage underneath. They broke through the underbrush into a clearing, and there it was. The ship, sleek and dark, partially buried beneath twisted vines. Their salvation. But between them and the ship stood a squad of Salvarian insurgents, weapons raised. Kayla didn't hesitate. She let go of Dax and surged forward, her blades cutting through the air in a blur of light. The first soldier fell before he even realized she was there. The second managed a single shot before she was on him, slicing his weapon in half and bringing him down with a swift, brutal strike. Dax raised his gun, fighting through the pain. He took down one of the insurgents covering the others, but his vision was tunneling. He wasn't going to last much longer. Kayla fought like a storm, swift, deadly, unstoppable. Dax had seen skilled fighters before, but nothing like this. She moved with precision and fury, every strike calculated and lethal. But there were too many. Dax's knees buckled, and he went down hard. He heard Kayla scream his name, but he couldn't answer. The darkness was closing in. Then there was silence. Dax opened his eyes slowly. The clearing was littered with bodies, the scent of burnt ozone heavy in the air. Kayla knelt beside him, her face pale and streaked with blood. Some of it hers, most of it not. "You're not dying," she said, her voice shaking. "Do you hear me? You are not dying." "Wouldn't dream of it," Dax murmured, though his body disagreed. Kayla's hands were surprisingly gentle as she pressed a medpack to his wound. He winced, but the pain was secondary to the warmth of her touch. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "You saved my life more times than I can count. I won't let you go now." The ship loomed behind them, their way out of this nightmare. But as Dax looked at Kayla, the fire in her eyes, the fierce determination on her face, he realized something had changed between them. They weren't just survivors. They were partners, and the fight wasn't over yet. The air on Earth was colder than Kayla expected, but that wasn't the only thing that felt hostile. The moment they stepped off the transport ship, she could feel the eyes on her. Suspicion, hatred, and fear. She stood tall, though, refusing to show weakness. Dax walked beside her, his presence steady and protective. Despite everything they'd been through, their fight was far from over. The news hit fast. The Salvarian Empire had branded Kayla a traitor. Her own people had turned against her, blaming her for the failure of the peace and accusing her of collaborating with humans. Dax wasn't treated much better. The higher-ups in the human military were demanding answers, and they wanted Kayla handed over. "They think you're a liability," Dax told her one night, his voice tight with frustration. They were holed up in a secure military compound, but safety felt like an illusion. "They don't understand what's really happening." "They don't want to," Kayla said, arms crossed. She stared out the window at the lights of the human city. It was so different from Salvaris, cold metal and glass rising into the sky, but somehow alive. "They want someone to blame, and I'm an easy target." Dax stepped closer, his voice softening. "We'll figure this out, together." The promise in his words warmed something inside her, but before she could respond, the wall exploded. The shockwave knocked them both to the ground, and the room filled with fire and smoke. Dax was already moving, pulling her behind cover as plasma bolts rained through the breach. "They found us," Kayla hissed, drawing her blades. "No," Dax said grimly, checking his weapon. "They'd never lost us." The attack was swift and brutal. The assassins were Salvarian, but their armor was unmarked. Insurgents, not loyalists. They moved with military precision, But Kayla was faster. She danced through them like a storm, blades flashing, and Dax covered her with sharp, precise shots. When the dust settled, they were both bleeding, and the compound was in ruins. "They're getting bolder," Dax said, breathing hard. "We can't wait any longer." Kayla nodded, wiping blood from her face. "We take the fight to them." Their plan was reckless, but they didn't have a choice. Using stolen cloaking technology, they hijacked a small stealth ship and set course for a Salvarian warship rumored to be the insurgents' base of operations. The journey was tense, but Dax's strategic brilliance kept them one step ahead. When they finally boarded the warship, all hell broke loose. The corridors were a maze of danger. Dax led the way, his military training keeping them moving fast and smart. Kayla was a force of nature, cutting down enemies with terrifying efficiency. The ship shook as orbital bombardments rained down on the planet below, a distraction to keep human forces occupied. "We have to stop this," Dax said as they fought their way toward the command center. Kayla's eyes flashed. "We will." The closer they got, the fiercer the resistance became. They moved through smoke and fire, their breath ragged and bodies aching. Dax took a hit to the shoulder, but he kept going. Kayla's blades dripped with blood, but she didn't falter. When they reached the command center, the truth hit them like a hammer. The insurgents weren't just trying to reignite the war. They were planning an all-out genocide, and the first target was Earth. "We're out of time," Dax said, his voice cold with determination. Kayla nodded. "Then let's finish this." The chaos around them was deafening. Dax could barely hear the battle cries of the insurgents over the sound of the thundering explosions and the shrill whine of weapons fire. He pushed forward, bleeding, with only one thought on his mind: Kayla. She was ahead of him, carving a path through the enemy with brutal precision. Her battle cry rang through the corridors, and for a brief moment, it was as if the entire war had converged into this one final moment. They had come this far, through countless battles, ambushes, and betrayals. Now they were inside the heart of the enemy's stronghold, facing a force so deadly that it had the power to wipe out everything they had fought for. But the real battle wasn't with the insurgents, it was with the past, and Kayla was about to face that past head-on. As they reached the command center, Dax caught sight of Kayla's eyes. They were filled with rage, but underneath it was something else. Something deep, something personal. They had crossed every line together, and there was no turning back. Her blood was on his hands, and his on hers, but it didn't matter. This was it. The moment where they would either destroy everything they had worked for or find a way to survive. Inside the command center, the leader of the insurgents stood waiting. But it wasn't just any leader, it was Kayla's cousin. The bloodline they shared was now the very thing that would destroy them both. He was standing there, his expression cold and calculating. He didn't even flinch when they entered. "So you finally found me, Kayla," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "I always knew you would be the one to ruin everything." Kayla's eyes narrowed, and Dax could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just a fight for survival. This was personal. "You betrayed our people," Kayla spat, stepping forward. "You betrayed your own blood, and now you'll pay for it." Without warning, the battle began. Her cousin lunged at her with a cruel snarl, and the two engaged in a brutal, unforgiving fight. The clash of weapons echoed through the room, and Dax watched as Kayla fought with everything she had. Every strike was calculated, every movement fluid, but her cousin was just as skilled. A deadly adversary. The fight raged on, neither of them willing to give an inch. Dax couldn't just stand there. He forced himself to move, his body still bleeding, but his resolve stronger than ever. As he stepped forward, the sound of a gunshot rang through the air. Kayla's cousin had made a fatal mistake. He had underestimated them. In a flash of movement, Kayla's blade found its mark. She drove it deep into her cousin's chest, and with a final scream, he crumpled to the ground. The room fell silent. Kayla stood there, breathing heavily, her blade stained with his blood. Dax approached her cautiously, his hand on her shoulder. "It's over," he said softly. Kayla looked down at her fallen cousin, a mixture of sorrow and relief in her eyes. The family she had once been so close to was gone, and with them, any chance of peace. But there was no time to mourn. They had won, but the cost was far greater than they had anticipated. Kayla turned to Dax, but her face paled when she saw the extent of his injuries. He had been wounded in the fight, badly. Blood was soaking through his uniform, and he was struggling to stay on his feet. She rushed to his side, but her heart sank as she realized how much damage had been done. "No, no, no," she muttered, pulling him into her arms. You can't die on me, Dax. Not now." His eyes fluttered open, and a weak smile crossed his face. "I'm not going anywhere," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not done yet." Despite his condition, he managed a faint chuckle, and Kayla felt her heart tighten in her chest. She had never imagined this. She had come here hating humanity, hating everything about them. But Dax was different. He had become more than just her ally. He had become her anchor. She wasn't sure how long they stayed there, holding each other in the silence that followed the battle. But finally, Kayla knew what she had to do. She couldn't let him die. Not like this. With a strength she didn't know she had, Kayla managed to get Dax to a medbay on the ship. There she tended to his wounds, her hands shaking with fear and urgency. She couldn't lose him. Not now. Not when they had fought so hard to get here. Hours passed, and slowly Dax began to recover. He was still unconscious, but his breathing had evened out, and his wounds were healing. Kayla sat by his side, refusing to leave him. She couldn't. She had never realized how much she cared for him until she saw him on the brink of death. When Dax finally woke up, his first words were simple, but they meant everything. "We did it. We're still alive." Kayla smiled, her hand on his chest. "And we're not done yet." The war ended soon after, but it wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. The insurgents were defeated, but the scars they left behind would never heal. And neither would Kayla. She had lost everything, but in Dax, she had found something she never thought possible: a future. The Earth leaders had to make a decision. Would they welcome her, or would they exile her for her crimes? It didn't matter. Kayla had already made up her mind. She was done running from her past. She was done being defined by it. And as long as Dax stood by her side, she knew she could face whatever came next. In the end, Kayla wasn't just a princess. She was a warrior. And she had found her place beside humanity's greatest soldier. Together, they would fight for a future they had fought for. A future where love, loyalty, and honor mattered more than bloodlines. Their story wasn't just one of survival. It was a story of defiance, of love, and of a bond strong enough to change the fate of two worlds. And as they stood together, shoulder to shoulder, ready to face whatever came next, they knew that the future was theirs to shape. Together, they could change everything.